Hi
Good.
everyone, welcome to the Building Brain Awareness Talk series. Today we have Julie Stoots, who's the director of the Sensory Learning Institute, and Julie's gonna talk all about it. And everyone, feel free to ask questions.
Really glad to be here, Dan and Randy, and just hope I can share some useful information. So, our program is a sensory learning program, and we're all about the sensory systems, which I know isn't necessarily the first thing you think about when when there's an injury. But I wanted to share some information that might sort of explain the connection and just share a little bit of what we've collected over the years about the relationship. We're working with the three main languages of the brain: the visual, the vestibular, which is about balance, and then the third one is the auditory. And these are, we really started out by working with kids that had different delays when we didn't know why, we didn't know how. And we started to understand that when we're break it down to these three simple languages of the brain, we've got a way to really influence the whole nervous system gently, but very consistently. And so this is where we begin, is that we're working with the way that we orient ourselves, both in space and in time. And it's not just seeing, it's not just hearing, but it's these three systems really come together to help us orient about where we are, giving us our spatial awareness, giving us a sense of sequence and the passage of time. And when there's an injury, and it can be of so many different varieties, we know that no two injuries are the same. Um, but what's damaged often is the way that these systems are communicating together. And this is really about the foundation of how we orient ourselves, how we feel like ourselves, if that makes sense a little bit. So we think often when there's an injury, where there's delay, a learning problem, we're always looking at sort of that beachfront real estate. We're looking at our ability to do math, we're looking at our reading, we're looking at our ability to express ourselves. And yet, when we go below the surface, we really see that that this performance is dependent on a lot of sensory connections coming together to give us accurate information and organize our response. So visual and vestibular is one of the main connections. And 90% of the time with a concussion or a head injury, this relationship between the visual information that we gather and the balance, the vestibular information, is not coming together as synchronized as we'd like it to be. So what we're really seeing is that it's this functional connectivity that can be injured itself. Um, we started out working with autism, and many years ago, they would uh, do these structural images of the brain and say, I don't know why he's not learning or why he isn't able to do this, because all the parts are there. And it's rather recent, as the imaging has evolved, that we can really see that it's all about the connections. One area of the brain being able to share and coordinate its information with another. So we know that the sensory systems, it's really the language, it's really the currency of the brain. And so every sensory experience that we have is really creating its own synapses. And so if you look at this image on the left, that's an area where there was an injury, a damage, and there's a lack of pathways. And yet, when we engage in a sensory experience and a sensory environment that's rich and engaging, we automatically, the brain has these idling neurons that come together to create new pathways. And so this neuroplasticity, this potential for new neural pathways is always there. And it's just about creating an acceptable way to re-engage and begin to rebuild the pathways that we need. And I don't mean to make it sound simple, and yet if we take it a step at a time, we actually see quite a lot of response. neuroplasticity. Eric Kandel back in 2000 won the Nobel Prize, and part of what his research yielded is that sensory input can reconstruct neural networks to such an extent that new, healthier proteins, genes, and DNA are created. And so we've really been documenting this ability of sensory signals to create new pathways for for almost 25 years now. Um, Specific to our program back in 2016, we worked with a group of 25 people with head injuries of many different kinds and different ages. And we started to track things like memory, things like auditory processing, things like reading ability. Um, and there's a lot of really satisfying things that we were able to document. One is that a person can be years after their injury and still have this neuroplastic potential. And that when we're working, starting at the beginning with this sensory process of reestablishing connections, that we saw 84% of the people rebuild some of their functional capabilities, some of their performance skills. And this is another thing that was really encouraging to us. So I thought I would just break that down a little bit. Um, in terms of post-concussion, everything's a little different, and it's not just all of one or all of another. But we tracked how many people of this initial group saw an improvement in the different areas, looking at sleep difficulty, anxiety, just trying to capture as much data as we could. One of the things that we know is that imbalance or dizziness is considerably something that people are dealing with. It can affect the gait, the balance, but has a big impact on our freedom, our quality of life. Because we're working with both the visual system and the balance, the vestibular system, we're really able to reconnect these two. And 70% of people saw an improvement in balance or a reduction in dizziness. And this is really in part about the vestibular ocular reflex. When we're using these simple sensory languages to recalibrate the systems of the brain that keep our eyes working with our sense of motion and where we are in space, we also saw 90% of the people had a reduction in the double vision that they were dealing with. And so it really is about recalibrating some of our sensory functions after a concussion, after a brain injury. Another area is just concentration and focus. And part of what we see is that tension is something that we're building. We start receiving the sensory signals as they are processed first at the brainstem, and then that information flows up the brainstem to the midbrain and then to the cerebral cortex, creating memory. It goes forward to the frontal lobe where we make associations. We remember that other thing that was part of what we wanted to do. Maybe it was a name of the person that we met or the time of the appointment. And yet this is really influenced strongly by the clarity, accuracy, and strength of the sensory signal that things start with. So as we make this pathway more efficient, we're also rebuilding this attention loop. And so attention and concentration, we saw 84% of people have a lot of relief. Memory in itself improved about 200%. And that really satisfying. And of course, it's also organizing our response, whether it's a decision or it's a motor function, deciding which way we're going to turn in the hallway. And so again, we start really at the base with some of these simple things, but we find that it's the sort of the foundation for so many of the more complex skills that we want in the end. We did another study that was published in the Journal of Aggression, Maltreatment, and Trauma. And here we were talking about sort of the trauma of injury, not talking about an emotional state so much as talking about how the nervous system responds to a severe injury, severe illness, or that type of threat. And our part of what it does is sort of mark the sensory characteristics of whatever happened. So if we were in a car accident, some of the sounds that associated with that can become hypersensitive. And it's the body's mechanism to try to keep us out of from those dangerous environments. This is just part of what we measure to understand where the sensitivities are. We're looking at frequencies in hertz going across the top of the graph, and we're looking at decibels going along the side. So when you see, for instance, if we're looking at the red circles, we're talking about the threshold of sensitivity for the right ear. Sometimes it's low, and then we have it shooting up. And because decimals are logarithmic, the experience is that this frequency or this sound is 10 times louder than this frequency or this sound in the way that we hear it. And so this is one of the ways that the nervous system has sort of taken over with a priority to protect us. And yet, as we try to go forward, it leads to distractions and just difficulty having conversations at home, at work. And so part of what we found is that we can reduce this experience of hypersensitivity about 81% of the time.
This is really fascinating in terms of the description you're providing of the bottom level to higher level of the brain's functions and circuits, and you have some really choice words with the beachfront property and the relief and the coming together of the networks. Do people accept that or think that that's a real thing, or do you run into, I guess, misunderstanding with that in explaining this big picture of what you're doing?
I see what you're saying, I think. Um, and yet the words really came trying to describe what people experienced.
Yeah.
Um, and so as they're going through the program, this is really how we develop the language. But when we're talking about the beach, my analogy with the beachfront property, we know that there are a lot of executive functioning skills that we want. And I can back up here. We know that a lot of what people are searching for or what people articulate is I want better memory, I want better um, cause effect, better executive function. I want my decision making to be easier. And that makes complete sense. And yet what we find is that it's not just about the frontal lobe. It's about this information that starts at the brainstem, being able to successfully, accurately, in a good synchronized pace, be able to reach all of these marks and then reach the frontal lobe. That information in the frontal lobe is integrated and accurate and timely. And this is what supports actually our the improvement in memory, the sense of the passage of time, as well as that ability to think either or, to have decision making be more easy and automatic. Does that address what you were asking?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, I consider it like a seamlessness of what the brain had before my brain injury. Yeah, to focus on it so that people who don't understand that that's a thing can really realize that. Because I think what you're describing is really cool, and methodologically, it's a fascinating way to approach brain injury problems. The other question I had is I was wondering if you could at least later or in your slides get into the procedure or the like how does this work and how does it what do someone go through when they go into this kind of a treatment?
The process itself we keep rather simple, and because we 32 years ago, the real um, focus was working with kids that had learning problems. My mom was the founder, and my brother was really her inspiration. The As smart as he was, there were things that he couldn't do, um, and and this was the focus of her research, to find a way to help develop to make sure that he wasn't slipping through the cracks, um, and to really build some of the skills so that he could be understood and effective. And so, part of what, um, so she created this gentle program that involves working with frequencies of light that are soft, not challenging, working with music that's not loud, but is sort of taken apart so that it's almost an auditory jigsaw puzzle. And underlying it is this vestibular stimulation. And I might try to come back to this when I've got a picture that would support the idea a little more. But working with these three things in a way that's novel or unexpected is part of what's engaging the system and beginning to lay down these neural pathways. So it's not an onslaught, it's not an overwhelm or pushing through of sensitivities, but it's finding a way to we always try to measure or understand a person's sensitivities and then come back to create a system that's going to be just a little bit of a challenge and gentle enough to keep the system comfortable um, and sort of online. And then we do this every day for almost 2 weeks. It's a 12-day, and yet again, as we take one step at a time, we see these new neural pathways build. And part of what we understand now is that it takes just about 45 days for a new neural pathway to mature. And yet it's a little like road construction. Once we've have a more efficient function, say in the brainstem, we can go up to the cerebral cortex and they're building new neural pathways because they're receiving more information, more traffic. And so we really see a cascade of events starting when we begin in the brainstem to make the sensory messages more accurate, more efficient.
That makes sense, and thank you for explaining the pieces and how they get introduced to the person. There's a question in the chat. Are you primarily working with adults? First part of the question, and then is it matching the program with the unique individual question mark?
So we work with both children and adults just because that's how we began. And we find that whether we're working with a child that might be on the autism spectrum or an adult that's had a brain injury, we're still working with brains that are more alike than they're different.
Right.
And the thing about the program is that we always begin with an evaluation where we're looking to understand the areas that are super sensitive, the areas that are under responsive. And when we talk about the sensory languages, are the visual and the balance system working together? Or is there a breakdown perhaps between our balance and our auditory processing? So we know that these things are specific to the individual, and we go into a program trying to understand as much as possible where the strengths and weaknesses of the person are. So it's not a cookie cutter, it's not one size fits all. And yet, as we focus on the sensory processing, we can work with both children and adults quite effectively. Um, does that begin to answer the question?
Yes, thank you. Great.
So, this mapping of the auditory sensitivity is part of what we do for everybody. And that gives us some of the information about what they're sensitive to. And then when we design an auditory program, the auditory portion of the program, we can be more specific and responsive to exactly what their perception is and where their sensitivities are. And so when we reduce some of these sensitivities, it's not through an onslaught, it's almost through more of a homeopathic response to what they're sensitive to, that we see the system relax and become more consistent and more dependable in the way that it relays information. Um, so one of the other things that we see change a lot is sleep wake cycles, just the ability to get a good night's sleep. 75% of the people that we worked with noticed that their sleep got much better, that they were able to dream, that they woke up more rested. And part of what we understand is that the sensory systems feed into the nervous system, giving them context. And so changing between sort of a parasympathetic state, for instance, the colors in the sunset, there are a lot of visual cues that help our nervous system organize. And so as we work with the sensory systems, we see the nervous system get much more effective or almost sort of recaptured, be better calibrated about shifting us both into a state where we are getting really good recuperative sleep during the night, but also getting good, focused, alert hours during the day. We see these things as two sides of the same coin. And working through the sensory systems, we're just helping the nervous system to again recalibrate and have that function improved or restored. So this is really what we're looking at, and just wanted to encourage people to reach out to us at Sensory Learning at the website. We've got a place where you can, enter a little bit about what your concerns are or what your goals are. And then one of us can reach out to you just to have a conversation about how effectively we might match up with your goals. I just wanted to put that out there. I just wanted to reference Marianne Diamond was the head of the Berkeley Hall of Science, and she worked more with kids, but part of what she understood is that a sensory rich environment is always going to create more neural density, which is about health and effectiveness for the brain.
Yeah.
Let me just skip ahead maybe to the things that would be most useful. This is what our program actually looks like. We create a resource state where we have a bed that looks like a massage table, and as it moves gently at about a merry-go-round speed, we bring in different frequencies of light in a darkened room. So again, the nature of the program isn't about being loud or bright and withstanding it, but about creating a comfortable area where people can be comfortable while they receive some of the sensory messages, and that's how we begin to retrain. So some people compare this to some of the EMDR, and they find this a somewhat gentler process. And really that's what we're working toward, is starting with people wherever they are. So with the kids, sometimes that means we're working with a child that's maybe 10 or 15 months old. And for a person that's got some dizziness or some sensitivity to sound, it means that we create this resource state of sensory signals, but we begin at a volume, at an intensity that's comfortable, or just very that has a very small amount of challenge. And that's where we begin to rebuild a pathway to remove perhaps some of the trauma associated, and to rebuild the connections between the vestibular and the visual, or the auditory and the visual. And so that's how it begins to look, how it begins to work. Really keeping people's sensitivities in mind is where we're usually starting.
In that situation, you're presenting the different stimuli and you're measuring what the person's response is initially, like you set a baseline, or where.
So, and we start before we even go into the session room with some perceptual tests that are telling us where the visual spatial integration is, to what degree are they sound sensitive, and to what frequencies. We want to understand sometimes a balance test to know where we're starting, and whether it's about the vestibular system and their central vision, or the vestibular system and their peripheral vision. So we really try to gather a lot of information. And then when we go into the session room, we're tailoring things to meet their needs with a small amount of challenge, but something that's always going to be uh, something that's always going to be comfortable, something that's always going to be doable. And that's really what we see. A lot of times the the problems with memory or focus or distractibility are about these processing, these connections that let us integrate the information into something that has meaning, into the pattern that's really making us effective at understanding our environment, at tracking what's happening in a routine, at understanding the passage of time. And so we're rebuilding these connections between the sensory systems. We're creating this foundation again, so that again, we've got that higher cortical skills, which are often what we're focused on more. But it's starting down with that, starting down in the brainstem with effective sensory processing that we can depend on and is giving us sort of the raw material, the raw data accurately and consistently.
Can
Um,
I ask you another question about that? Because I think that's really fascinating. Or how would you describe? It seems like you're almost exploiting or utilizing the brain's ability and desire to want to make pattern recognition and make sense of these systems to some extent. Like we need to integrate it in ourselves to some extent. And is that like a feature of the brain that this relies upon?
I think that the brain is in several aspects a pattern um, pattern recognizing machine.
Yeah.
Um, and it underlies our memory and our associations and has a lot to do with our learning of new information. And so one of the neuroscientists, Sam Pleasure, kind of talked about this, is that all day long we're walking around trying to associate various sensations and sometimes the emotions so that we can remember them accurately and also sort of relate them if we um, all these stimuli sort of create this circuit, this experience. Every sensory experience is creating a neural pathway. And if you think of it in terms of kids, small kids will learn how a kitchen cupboard opens, and then they're going to open and close it over and over, and then it becomes automatic. When we damage a circuit, we see that repetition less, but sometimes it's really about reestablishing the first step of that connection, of that memory
Mhm.
for us to be efficient again.
Yeah, I agree with that perspective, and it's parts that get ripped out with brain injury are stuff that isn't observed or you don't notice it because you're already up here and what's down here got injured. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I do have a question. Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
a couple of questions. How much after a brain injury have you worked with people? Has it always been, like within the first 6 months, or has it been 5 years later? That's the first question. How much after a brain injury? The second question, I guess, is have you ever worked with elderly people? Oh, I'm sorry.
I think there are a lot of us that are either part of that population or so but those are great questions. So in this table, I'm just going back to this data because one of the columns is we were measuring how many days from the injury to the start of the program. And so in a couple of these, you can see 1,461 days. And so we're talking about between 4 and 5 years after the injury. 940, so almost 3 years, 1,096, again, 3 to 4 years. And we see improvements at this stage. One of the more significant gentlemen that we got to work with was a pilot for NASA who was part of a helicopter crash during inclement weather. And his brain injury affected his gait, affected his speech. Something that he also brought up with frustration is that affected his golf game. Um, there were a lot of things that he could tolerate, but really, losing his handicap, he joked he wasn't willing to give that up. And we worked with him 9 years after his accident and saw improvements in those areas, self-expression, speech, smoothness of gait, improvements of balance. So we do see that this neuroplasticity continues. The oldest person in our files was 93. The brain injury that she had took the form of her third stroke. We see anoxic events. I know is not necessarily something everybody relates to, but she was the matriarch of the family. She was a very articulate woman, and yet suddenly she was just having trouble tracking conversations, staying alert. And the family had done all the typical things. They had hearing aids and things like that. And yet when she went through the program, she became more alert. She was participating in the family dinners, in the conversations. And she actually didn't go back to using her hearing aids again. So we see this neuroplasticity at this point being very easy to document, whether a person is in their 80s or even their 90s. And I just think it's great. It really does mean that we have this wonderful design that's there to support recovery at almost any age we can imagine, if we're willing to support it with the right pieces of the puzzle.
Julie, this is Randy. I went through this, what, 5 years ago or something like that?
I think that, yeah, just after COVID.
About 20 years, maybe a little bit more than that after my injury. And the experience was pretty damn profound, as you well know.
Thanks for making that note. It's 20 years. That's right.
It was about 20 years after my injury, and
I have a podcast recording with Randy about his description of that experience. I'll put on the YouTube video in the end. But yeah, I think it's I like how Randy describes it because it's hard to make sense of what changes in you, but he definitely describes an improvement. If I may share a thought about aging and brain injury, or rather from when the brain injury happened to when the improvement happens, the brain injury changes the way it works and makes it work less efficiently, but it's still working. It's still working. We're still trying as hard as it can. And then when you get that shift in the sensory input, or what Julie describes here as shifting to improvement, to deal with what was impaired, is just gonna help it, or it's not gonna make it worse. It's already made worse, but it's still constantly functioning. It's a very dynamic process that we don't understand in any. We're starting to understand it, but there's a lot going on. So I think no matter what time from the brain injury happens, if you get that shift, that's going to lead to some improvement. And I think the nature in brain injury is so different than other conditions that we need to be able to think about it like that, which leads to another question. Julie, do you accept insurance, and has it been hard to like get that process to work for your clients?
The insurance process has been difficult. So I'm in Boulder, Colorado, and we're working with some therapists that are in different locations around the states. Myself, I'm really coming from what's considered more of an educational background, and if the insurance can find a reason not to cover it, they tend to. Some of the occupational therapists or developmental optometrists have been more successful in finding insurance codes that describe the process and get some coverage. For ourselves, we really try to make payment plans or work with Care Credit or other things, because we never want the financing to be an obstacle. And we have some centers that are working to work with Medicaid. And again, there's a lot of hoops. Sometimes it feels like sometimes it feels a little like a gamble to talk about insurance. But I think it's kind of a beach that we keep storming to try to be more effective that way.
Yeah, and in that analogy, it's not a friendly discussion. It's a fight and a battle, and many brain injury people that don't have the right support are fighting that each time. So that's good to know about, and sorry to hear that it's not so smooth. How many locations do you have?
We've got about 30 locations around the states. And we're always working with a therapist that has a background and an interest. And a lot of times somebody came to us and then went back to their therapist who said, you've got to make this local, it's makes a difference. And so then maybe it was the developmental optometrist or a speech pathologist or a PT or an occupational therapist that said, okay, let's make this part of the program because I see how it can be helpful. Um, so
How do you
there
find
wa-
those locations?
um, if people want to send some information in through sensorylearning.com, we've got a system where we'll get back to you, or if we've got a system near you, we'll automatically send that to the nearest location so that they can reach out and you can have a very direct conversation about um, their availability and setting up a consult, a chance to come in, ask more questions. And a lot of the centers will make a time for you to experience the program so that it really becomes a known quantity about how it feels. And you also, in that chance, in that exposure to it, can get a little bit of an idea about how you can respond to a sensory intervention. We want to give everybody a lot of information so that they can really make an informed decision about something that is a little different from maybe what they've seen up till now in their therapy program options.
Producing a quantity of it so that they can make sense of what it is. Because yeah, that's great. Are there any other questions?
I went
Okay.
through this about 5 years ago. It was not covered by insurance, so I paid out of pocket. All I could tell you is that about halfway through, and I'm not embellishing here, I woke up in the hotel that morning, I think it was on a Sunday, and the entire room was spinning like a carousel. I didn't know what to make of it. That lasted for a few minutes, it stopped. We had to drive a few miles to where Julie is. It's in a rural area outside of Port Boulder. When we got to the house, I got out of the car. Her dog came out. I leaned over to pet it, and the entire outside world started spinning like a carousel. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not embellishing. I dropped myself to the ground so I wouldn't fall. It subsided, and I finished the program. I think the only way I know how to describe this is that I think what it did was somehow recalibrate my brain.
And that's really a strange experience. I
It
yeah.
is. And it was well, I mean, it wasn't cheap, but it was well worth it. Now I'm going back 5 years ago. I don't know to what extent any of this may have changed in terms of the insurance industry, but the problem that I had was I was in Oregon, she was in Colorado, and the insurance that I had was with Regents Blue Cross Blue Shield. It was outside of their territory, and that was probably the biggest obstacle to them covering it. I suspect that probably would still be true today, but I don't know.
I think for everyone that I meet and in my life, the insurance keeps getting tighter and tighter. I mean, they're an industry and
Don't even get me started.
we don't need to get started. Julie, what Randy just described, have you heard other clients talk about that? And what is that?
So that was really a, a balance, a response from the balance system. And so in a way, often as we go through the program, somewhere during the process, we see things sort of make a big change. There's a response. Something can get, sometimes it's more comfortable, sometimes it's just something very different. And it's always great to see the system have the ability to respond to what we're doing. That's the biggest indicator of success and change. And yet it definitely does kind of take a person by surprise sometimes.
That's an understatement.
Well, it's your brain and your mind. That's the thing, that brain injury is a mind injury. And people, I said that to doctors and they say, you can't say that. And I was like, what are you talking about?
Why couldn't you say that? when you just did?
Because they don't have the literature to support that, and so I stopped trying to fight with them about it. But are there other sensory changes like visual or I mean it's almost a hallucination, but hallucination is not the right term here.
I think that there are some,
Do you mean disassociation, Mr. Dan?
No, it's not a disassociation because in this case you're using a stimuli to change the networks in the brain to shift them and improve their synchronicity. A dissociation, I had multiple levels of dissociation. This is not that. This is on par with that and how weird it is, but it's not that. Julie, what do you think?
I think this is the opposite of a disassociation.
Mm.
I think after an injury or something, especially that has some trauma to it, that's when we sort of disconnect from our experience, from the flow of information from the environment to sort
Yeah.
of protect ourselves. And yet, if we're doing this in the right way, we're really reestablishing the flow of information from the environment in a way that's safe, manageable, and feeding our understanding. And so one of the things that we're doing is really re-engaging the sensory systems. When we talk about trauma, sometimes we talk about reclaiming a sensory pathway. Trauma, sometimes a sensory signal begins to send us into fight or flight. And so it sort of shuts down the conscious memory, conscious choice, and we're sort of being run by our midbrain or the reticular activating system. We're sort of just reacting. When we reclaim a sensory pathway, build it from the perception all the way up to where the forebrain is getting the information, the frontal lobes, then we're creating a sensory experience that we're staying conscious of, that's giving us choice. But it really happens a step at a time. We really are rebuilding something of a highway. And so for Randy, all of a sudden he was getting, it was almost, I think in that moment, like a vertigo experience, but the inner ear was responding with this strong sensation of from his balance system. And it was great to see it come online at the same time that it was different and a little unsettling in the moment. Is that fair to say, Randy?
Yeah.
In the podcast that I recorded with Randy, because I dug into this, he says it's like the windshield of reality gets clearer, and then he goes back to describe how other exercises and Tai Chi and ping pong helped to clear the windshield, but it was then like that he lived with this unclear windshield, but he didn't realize it until that point. And then when I asked him what's the windshield, he's like, I can't say. And it's these levels of I've had 8 in the first 7 years of my brain injury, I had 8 minds where I was like, this is changing in me and I can't describe it. And it's your brain and it's the integration of the systems in your brain. So Julie, then you see this different kind of stuff in different people as their brain responds.
Yeah, and it's always going to be. There was one woman that we worked with, and she went through a lot of physical trauma as a child, and she went through the program not once but a series of times. But part of what she said is that each time she went through, she felt like there was a new connection that gave her more memory, more choice, more freedom. And I think that the way she put it actually was quite brilliant, because it's the way our brain associates, connects, shares information to get this very complete picture and to help us make a choice of action or a response and expression. And it's all about the information being integrated so that we're not just responding to a sight or responding to a sound, but that we're understanding the whole experience and where we are within the experience. When we go through injury and trauma, part of the preservation is creating a barrier or a buffer between us and some of the painful experiences that we've gone through. And so to reconnect means that often it feels like there are fewer barriers that, and some people describe that it's feeling more like themselves or
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And
I
the
was just reading about this in Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps a Score. I was just reading about this last night. And Julie, I think you hit the, no pun intended, but you hit the nail right on the head.
that you're always reading the best stuff, Randy.
he's always reading the best stuff, but Randy and I speak constantly, and I keep reminding him that the brain injury nature of this kind of trauma is different. It doesn't fit trauma.
In the
There's an
conventional,
overlap, but there's a lot that's unique to brain injury and the integration of the systems in a way that is because those systems got physically injured, physically damaged, physically
Yeah.
mushed. It's the hardware itself got the functionality of the hardware itself got shifted, and so that's why these kinds of therapies are important. And it does overlap with trauma. Then there's the trauma with life after brain injury. So there's overlap, but there's uniqueness, and that's yeah. I really appreciate this discussion. I was gonna say the aggravation, aggression. You mentioned the reticulated system or the brain system aside, there's a aggravation that comes with brain injury, and I think what you're describing is a good way to look at why it's there. It's not just a conscious decision. With, in addition to all the invisible problems, there's a lot of visible problems that happen to a person, but there's this stuff underneath it, and what you're describing is a really cool way to look at that. Somebody asked about the process. It takes question 12 days in a row, or how? What do you have to like commit to and
Logistically, we um, we do a day of evaluation where we might spend an hour or two with breaks where we're trying to understand sort of your perceptual terrain. Are there visual sensitivities? Are there auditory sensitivities? Where where is there a breakdown between sharing the information between the sensory systems? And sometimes we'll also use some of the standardized tests just so that we can, speak accurately. Here we're at 40%, and after the program, when we repeat those, we'll be able to compare and talk about improvement in a numeric data-based way. Once we've done that mapping, understand sort of where the terrain is, where we're starting, we design the session room, and um, we're going to do a session every day. And sometimes to make it easier, we like to break it up into 2 sessions. And part of what we talk about is that we're getting neuroplastic priority. We're creating this resource state that says, I need these skills. I need to be able to process this information. And we're breaking it down to the very beginning perception and processing. And so as we create this demand twice a day, every day, we do this over 12 days. So we're usually looking for a person to be near a center location for about 2 weeks. And this is what we need. This is enough to begin to see some things change in terms of the baseline. And at that point, we have a supportive program that's working with light, and we send that home with a person. So we really wanted to make this as available as possible. And we want to continue to have more locations open up. But if a person is able to, for instance, spend the time of a vacation near a center, then they can get this, then they can go through the program in its complexity, in its completeness.
so the completeness it has its like closing or start and then closing and versus having that support that goes home with them, like can you talk about the distinction between those?
Well, during the 2 weeks, we're really going to walk through the different functional states of the nervous system. And so there's going to be a series of challenges. Some are a little more focused on the brainstem. Others are going to be a little more focused on the midbrain and then the frontal lobe. We're working at, again, sort of walking through different functional states of the nervous system, from focused to relaxed. And so when we talk about recalibrating, this is a very accurate in a lot of ways that, and yet other people talk about you know, if the mind is a mansion, we're sort of going to walk through each room in an organized way to sort of clear, reconnect, make sure that it's all part of the same map, that the nervous system is working with something that's as complete as possible. At the same time, once we've got everything connected, once we've made these sort of the first round of neural pathways, we expect it to be followed by another and eventually another. And to make this process easier, we do send some support home in the work we're working with syntonic optometry. That's both supporting the visual system, which is one of the main languages of the brain. And at the same time, through the different frequencies of light, we can also help organize that nervous system in terms of sympathetic and parasympathetic sleeping and wake cycles, and at the same time bring it back from any challenges to a very balanced point of function. And sometimes that's part of the challenge of a recovery or a program, is that we can be challenged to the degree that we're sort of going into fight or flight, and we're not getting enough of that recuperative time. And so as we're bringing a person back to balance, we're really, it's useful to, it's a useful type of support to make sure that everybody is coming back, that the nervous system, that the connections are all continuing in this upward sort of circular pattern of growth.
Thanks. That makes a lot of sense. And
This the question is if your program could help with this, but I have a traumatic brain injury from about 4.5 years ago. My body perceives each side totally differently. It's like one side is about 4 inches shorter than the other side. One side is about 4 or 5 inches behind this other side. And my spatial stuff is off, and balance, of course, and it fatigues my brain just to, you know, live. And I have somatic symptoms that come on. And is this something that your program would be able to help? Because so far, the only thing I've been able to do to try to a solution that we had, I have a prism in my right eye to kind of bring my world more equal, but I would really love to know, like, what center in my brain is doing this, what is going on, and what kind of help I can get. Can that be fixed? And, you know, is there a chance of some kind of solution? As you know, insurance has been a nightmare, and my starting of recovery and the whole thing has just been roadblock after roadblock with insurance kind of stuff. I've had to pay for a lot of things myself, but can your program help with that?
So a lot of what you're describing is perceptual. And when we talk about the right and the left side of the body working together, to borrow a term from occupational therapy, they're talking about the ability to cross the midline, which is a developmental, it's sort of a developmental milestone. And yet in an injury, it's something that we can lose. And yet it's also something that we can rebuild. One of the
Because
things that we can do is visually, we're going to cross the midline about 300 times in a session. And so part of what we're encouraging is perceptually reconnecting that right with the left. And once we're, again, reaching that perceptual milestone, there are other parts of awareness that begin to drop in. When we talk about feeling like part of the body is back, it's perceptually, we're talking about some of these connections that are holding you back, making you feel not yourself, different from what your baseline was, from what your experience was prior to the accident. And yet, as we do begin with these sensory signals, creating the demand to integrate one side with the other side to get a more accurate perceptual image, we see the system respond and change and support support the different awareness, but also some of the perceptual skills that might be dependent on that awareness.
It's like my midline totally disconnected or something. It's like I could, trying to stand in water is like, I'm just like a windsock. I have nothing in my midline. It's like I cannot walk in water, you know, that is like up to my chest. There's just no way I cannot stand up. I have to have weights on my feet and stuff. It's like, it just disconnected or something in there.
I think it's a great description that you're providing. It's that feeling disconnected, I think is very accurate. And when we can start by reconnecting some of this perceptual foundation, it really can support a lot of other change in terms of our awareness, physically, but also emotionally, as well as some of the mental problem solving. One of the studies that that was done in Switzerland, they were looking at people that had a visual disability versus people that were both seeing and hearing. And part of what we began to understand is the idea that comes from the comic books that we've got one working sense and it's going to become, you know, super tuned and fill all the gaps. And yet what they really find is that we've got so many advantages when we compare the information of what we're seeing and what we're hearing in our environment, that it really gives us it gives us more complex strategies about how to understand, how to relate, or how to problem solve. And so it just sort of supports that as much as we can, we want to have the sensory systems working together. And because it opens a lot of avenues in the way that we think and experience.
Can I offer my 2 cents about this? And
Yeah.
I know we're keeping you, Julie, so thanks for speaking with us. So for example, I get offended with the term perception because when I injured my cognition, when I injured my double vision, the outside world and people that didn't understand what I was saying, they're big, oh, you just are perceiving it that way. And it's like, no, I injured and had some brain imaging with sort of cranial nerve damage, but not really. It was more 8 months of work to restore that function. And then the cognitive stuff was like 11 years to rebuild it without a tool that you're describing. And so in that sense, there's both the underlying problems of all these systems and the upper layers, for example, with a more severe brain injury, can also be injured. And then there's no way to know the distinction enough because the brain imaging data and the experiments aren't good enough yet. And I have several interviews with people that describe a bodily shift or a midline two parts to their body difference. And one really good talk series in this series has been the bodily self, the brain in regions that create the bodily self, which are integrated with the brain regions that create self and like a mental self. And there's two mental selves that their data gets into. And meanwhile, that's a higher level brain region that needs that feed input from the things that Julie is describing. And so whether you injured that one or both the perception, I have an interview with someone that describes their injury to perception, and I believe they're very accurate. So either way, it's going to get fixed or improved through, I believe, through something that Julie is providing. And I find it really fascinating that, I didn't hear about you until I heard it from Randy. And then it's like, how come I didn't know about this? My brain injury was in 99. So, um, anyway, there's just a few thoughts. I think it's very hard to know what's happening, but if there's benefit and you've seen it in enough clients, that's where the evidence is.
At the community center here,
Yeah.
like right now, we have 5 people. So meeting once a week, what could you suggest? Something we could do that for maybe part of the meeting, we could be working on some of this.
Okay, those are great questions. I wanted to first just thank Dan for making the distinction. And I just wanted to say that we are building our mind out of our our perception, and the perception in part is very physical and very real. And that's really what I'm trying to speak to, the physical moment by moment perception. And at the same time, when I'm talking about trauma, I'm not so much trying to talk about an emotional state, but talk about the way that the nervous system physically armors to protect itself when it goes through something that's threatening.
Right.
And so I just wanted to make sure that I was speaking respectfully, because I know that this is not simple and it does certainly affect our sense of self.
In my experience, there's that armoring and there's what's underneath the armor. And if you have enough self-awareness, and I've met, in fact, every person I've interviewed, it's the things underneath the armor that are injured in certain ways or not working. And so when you know it's the injury underneath the armor and you're dealing with that and you learn how to live with it and improve it over time, in my case, um, it's helpful to think of it as there's the perception of it and then what's underneath the perception, because you can really feel that part as well. So it's, yeah.
Yeah. And so some of these terms can be both talking about our mental emotional experience, and yet whenever possible, I'm trying to talk about the physiological process.
Of brain injury,
But
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, they're both there, and certainly they're both relevant. And you're right, it's hard to bring science into a conversation of how the physiology is impacting the mind. But
And the corpus callosum is a great example. The two hemispheres connecting, I look at it as equivalent to the connectivity between, there's all these super just connected brain regions, but the corpus callosum is an example of that. So it's one type that if you have a frontal
yes,
lobe injury or critical visual injury, that's going to affect how that part feeds in. But really, because it's all integrated, the midline is just one example with specific symptomology or whatever it does to what I don't know who spoke, but who just described it. It was a great description. So anyway, thanks. Sorry, we're getting definitely to the weeds. Ruth,
and
yeah,
so maybe to turn to was it Ruth's question about
yeah,
what could be done on a and so here I might reference some of Marion Diamond's work, who talks about a sensory rich environment is always going to help is in going to translate directly to the richness of our neural network. And so we want something that has variety and novel experiences. Um, and in sometimes when we talk in terms of recovery about trauma, we could quote um, Bruce Perry, who is an expert on child trauma specifically. But what he talks about is recovery depends on repetitive, novel, safe sensory experience. And so while there's a lot of specific characteristics about our program that are meant to support and be specific advantages when we talk about injuries, when we go out to support our neural health or recover after any type of injury, when we find an area where we feel safe and yet we can engage new people or have new conversations or new experiences, we're beginning to support our recovery, our development, and and our really our brain health day to day. If I hope that might be a little bit
Thank you,
useful or
thank
relevant.
you. Mhm.
and I also have to say, because I've been writing about this, if you think of learning as having a comfort zone and outside the comfort zone and wanting to stay safe, brain injury has also a fatigue and overwhelm and overexhaustion zone that
Yeah,
we need to respect that with our. So if you're giving yourself a sensory stimulation, don't do it at the expense of the other consequences that come from brain injury, being overdrawn, hitting your limit. And also without brain injury, people think of event this, event that, event this. Like your day has all these things. With brain injury, it's all feeding into one battery that is potentially having problems. So you need to really factor that into your planning.
I
Thanks.
think
All
that's
right.
a really important point. Yeah.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, I think we'll call it a day. We've been here for a while, and thank you all. This has been really informative. Great.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julie.
Really been a pleasure to be here and to talk with you again, Randy, and
It was good to see you.
get to share the information.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.